We're talking about a conspiracy that pervades private industry, nonprofits, and every single government in the world. What they are doing, these people who believe in free speech, is exactly the opposite of free speech. What they are trying to do is shut me down so I cannot respond, so that people on their side will not take me seriously. We don't get along with each other at all. We disagree with each other all the time, about what the reality of history is. They can kiss my ass. I'm not going to shut up. You think you're going to silence me? Like, kiss my ass. You guys are a bunch of flaming turds if you think I'm going to shut up. I focused and spent hours of my time on Joe Rogan on those points. So they are just wrong, and they're misinterpreting the evidence. And I don't know, that's just a bunch of weak if you excuse my language.
We have very different viewpoints on many things.
But a lot of these issues are American issues. They're not Republican or Democrat issues.
Welcome back to Elevated Thoughts. We're here today with Flint Dibble, an archaeologist and research fellow at Cardiff University, where he mostly studies ancient Greek civilizations. But you might know Flint best for his recent knockout debate with Graham Hancock on Joe Rogan's podcast, where he totally dismantled the Atlantis myth by simply using facts. This guy's known for bringing the heat when it comes to calling out pseudoscience and archaeology, and he is absolutely the real deal. So this is going to be a conversation you don't want to miss. Flint, I'm so stoked to have you here with us today. How are you, brother?
I'm doing okay. It's been a long week. I was traveling last weekend. This next weekend we have a big festival online, Real Archaeology. For anybody who's listening, I know this comes out after that, but everything should still be available online. Check us out at real-archaeology.com. And so lots of good stuff going on. Yeah.
Well, Flint, just to give you a little bit of a background on myself, I am the case study for what you were trying to accomplish, or so I think, on the Joe Rogan experience. I'm someone who's right-leaning. I've loved listening to Joe Rogan all the time. I've listened to Graham Hancock on him before and never really was interested too much, but nodded along and said, oh, pretty interesting stuff. I wish archaeologists would look into it. And when I stumbled upon your episode, if that was a 4-hour conversation, Flint, no exaggeration, within 15 minutes, I was totally converted just by the fact that you broke it down so simple. Can you tell us a little bit about the experience what is it like walking in to the Joe Rogan experience? Just tell us a little bit about that.
I mean, it was all a blur, so I don't remember everything, that's for sure. It was certainly a wild experience in the sense that so many people saw me. I mean, I never kind of expected that. And I didn't expect to have the impact that it had. I wasn't actually necessarily trying to reach people that believed Graham. I went in there thinking that people that believed him, they've consumed so much of his narrative that it's really difficult to actually wedge in the real archaeological perspective of real facts and evidence. And I would hope that it would have that effect on some people, but I was actually kind of surprised to see it have that kind of effect on so many of his former fans. I was actually just trying to mostly reach people who didn't really know, who did not know what to believe and what to expect, who weren't necessarily convinced of Graham Hancock's ideas, but wanted to hear what a real archaeologist would say about them. Those were actually the audience that I expected to reach, and I think I did. And so I was actually shocked to reach so many people like you. I mean, very pleased, don't get me wrong. Very, very pleased. But at the same time, it was not what I expected to actually accomplish, and that sort of knocked my socks off, and I think knocked the socks off of a lot of people. And that's why it was such a shocker in a sense.
Absolutely. Well, I remember I wrote a review after watching that initial debate, and you had commented on it actually and reposted it and said, well, hey, this wasn't even supposed to be a debate. I don't want to be seen as a winner or Graham as a loser. We just wanted to continue this conversation, like you said, elevate real facts. So no, we were totally grateful.
Yeah, and I mean, my role as well, look, I'm a teacher, I'm an educator. My goal is to go out there and not have a debate, because that's not how you debate facts. You don't debate science on a podcast. That's just, no matter what was said on a podcast, it's going to have zero impact on actual scientific interpretation. If Graham actually wants to convince actual scientists, he needs to publish stuff in a scientific venue, because that's where that discourse happens. And so, that's why the idea of it as a debate is silly. It's a debate over public opinion on this, not over the truth of the past.
So let's contextualize some of your experience here. I usually prescribe to you don't want to roll in the mud because that's where pigs like to play, right? But I noticed that you really have taken it head on, kind of, I don't want to say disinformation, but just misinformation for folks who may be just a little bit naive to what real archaeology looks like. So taking into context this battle that you've been waging online, and I think very, very successfully, was it all worth it?
Yeah, of course. I mean, definitely. Without a doubt, I think getting out the word and educating people about real archaeology is 100% worthwhile. It's what we all need to be doing. People are interested in the past. And I mean, look, people say, oh, don't debate pseudoscientists. But the problem is we live in a world where pseudoscience, pseudohistory, conspiracy theories, and all this kind of fake stuff is just growing in popularity. And archaeology is a perfect microcosm of this because, like while anti-vaxxer stuff is not being, pushed on Netflix or any legitimate sort of media platforms, pseudoarchaeology is. The History Channel has been pushing Ancient Aliens for over a decade, and now Netflix with Ancient Apocalypse. Amazon lists Graham Hancock books under the field of archaeology, despite Graham Hancock saying quite prominently, I'm not an archaeologist. Well then, why does Amazon put it in the archaeology category? Why is it listed as a docuseries on Netflix then if he doesn't think that what he does has that veneer of legitimacy? And that's why he is a pseudoarchaeologist. Whether he calls himself an archaeologist or not, he claims to be rewriting the paradigm of history, and Netflix, IMDb, Amazon, and whatnot present it as if it's factual when not a single scholar who actually understands archaeology, and not just scholars, not a single professional. Like there's plenty of professionals in the field of archaeology who have an undergrad education and they go digging, they publish stuff, they do real archaeology. They are professionals that do most of the work in the field. And nobody agrees with Graham Hancock if you're familiar with the evidence, not a single one. And
it sounds like he just doesn't like peer review. That's the problem.
No, he does not like critique, even though he's the one that pushed for a debate. He thought he'd be able to have a good time in his own venue and spin a narrative around, and I came up prepared,
That brings us, a little bit more recently, where he released season 2 on Netflix, despite the kind of smackdown that happened, despite the elevation of real archaeology and scholarship to say, hey, Graham, this doesn't make any sense. Now, season 2 came out about a week, or now that this is 2 weeks ago, and he showed up again on the Joe Rogan podcast, Graham solo this time. And Flint, I can't imagine how you felt when you opened up your app and listened to just the first sentence out of Joe Rogan's mouth. What was your reaction? Because, and maybe you could tell our listeners a little bit about what he said.
Well, I still don't have a full reaction yet. Let's put it that way. It's still a little news to me, and I want to see if he invites me on to reply or not, because that also impacts how I react, because it shows whether Joe is fully siding with Graham or if he's open to hearing another perspective. And right now it looks like he has Donald Trump going on later this week, so I'm going to assume he's not going to get in touch for at least a week, and in which case there's no reason to really reply to Joe's claims, because what he's heard is Graham's side of the story. And Graham and him are obviously old friends, and so that carries a lot of weight. But I got along quite well with Joe when I was there, so I was obviously disappointed to hear him just take Graham's side of view, and so far to not have had such an invitation come my way. The reactions online have been very mixed. I've noticed that a lot of Joe Rogan fans are still on my side. You can go through the subreddit of Joe Rogan's subreddit, and I would say it's fairly evenly mixed, despite the fact that Joe Rogan very much voiced he agreed with Graham's accusations of me and lying, and we'll talk about that in a second. Sure. But the fact that Joe Rogan said he very strongly agrees with Graham, it clearly has not swayed all of his fans.
Well, he very clearly accused you of twisting the facts. And when you look at what they're claiming, and during that episode, it was shocking, because what they're even claiming was like fairy dust at best. It was something that didn't even have a material effect on the conversation, right? And it was something about the number of shipwrecks that
it's absolutely silly. I mean, like, I showed up with about 250 slides prepared. Each of those slides had at least one citation on them. Some had up to like 10 citations on them, right? So I came with hundreds of citable facts and evidence and data sets. And in fact, by data set, I presented millions of data points on the various maps that I showed and the various data sets that I highlighted that showed what archaeology is based upon. And their entire critique of me playing fast and loose with the facts rests on, what, 2 claims? That I used the wrong number of shipwrecks, which I acknowledged months ago that I misread that article. That article said there's an estimate of 3 million shipwrecks. I thought that was an estimate of the number that have been documented. It's actually an estimate extrapolating from the number that have been documented, which is still 300,000 or so shipwrecks. So, you know, whether it's 3 million or 300,000, there's been a lot of underwater archaeology done to document not just shipwrecks, but everything that's on the submerged continental shelves relating to humans. And so, you know, whether I got that number right or wrong doesn't change anything. The other quibble that they have is that I somehow misrepresented ice core data and metals in ice cores, and I have responded to that. I have not misrepresented that at all. Ice cores have been extensively studied going back millions of years into the Earth's climate history and environmental history, and as well, more recently, into understanding human impacts on the environment. And what I presented were several examples of where ice cores have documented metallurgy in more recent history, ancient history, and prehistory, and we can see that clearly in a number of different ice cores and the types of metals that show up, and then the isotopic studies of them. What I didn't feel like I had to do was go into much detail on the stuff from prehistory, meaning from 10,000 years ago or earlier. As I just said quickly, none of that evidence, all the evidence that is there shows that it's all natural. And that is very true. If you go look at the evidence, the articles that ice core scientists have published, stretching back into the Pleistocene and into the Ice Age, they document different trace elements in ice core layers from those periods, and they demonstrate how they all have to deal with natural changes in the Earth's environment and climate. And not a single one talks about metallurgy, and in fact they've done the exact same tests, the exact same type of isotopic tests that tell you where those trace elements come from that were used to document mining in the Roman and medieval periods. And so all of those articles for the Ice Age say that that material is introduced naturally. It was even on the title of the article these people used to critique me. So they are just wrong, and they're misinterpreting the evidence, and what they've not addressed were the 2 disproofs. If you remember in my introduction on Joe Rogan, I said I'm coming here with 2 disproofs. One of them is the whole range of evidence for hunter-gatherers in the Ice Age itself, and the second one is the well-dated evidence for the development of agriculture and the domestication of plants and animals. I focused and spent hours of my time on Joe Rogan on those points. They have no critique for them. On the other hand, 2 different slides that I brought up for about a total of 3 minutes, they say that that shows that I'm a liar. And I don't know, that's just a bunch of weak if you excuse my language.
I think it's important to talk about how they rely on the inability to prove the negative, because you can't find the evidence of what I'm talking about. Then you have to always consider this positive, and it's an important theme that you always speak about, is we have to start from what we know, and then you build a record and out from there. So maybe you can highlight this theme for our viewers, because I think it is crucially important.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, you know, there's this idea that you can't prove a negative, and frankly, again, to use that language, that's because to prove a negative, what you need to do is prove a positive that's mutually exclusive with that negative. So when Graham Hancock says there's a global civilization that occupied the coasts during the Ice Age that are now submerged, well, to look at that, we can actually go look at Ice Age coastlines. And I did that, right? I went and I saw that there are multiple places where Ice Age coastlines are not submerged today. So, for example, I highlighted research done by my colleague, Professor Tom Strasser, on Crete, where the south coast of Crete, because of tectonic uplift, the African tectonic plate is going underneath the European one. It's pushing up the coastline of southern Crete and southern Greece even, and we actually can explore that Ice Age coastline, and we have found evidence for human hunter-gatherers and what they do, and excavated it. And I've been to the site that Tom Strasser has excavated, for example, and we know that it's hunter-gatherers and there's no advanced Ice Age civilization there. Another reason why Ice Age coastlines might be available is due to isostatic rebound. What that is the land is being pushed down by the weight of all the ice on top. So as that ice melts, yes, the ocean levels are rising, but there's less weight from the glaciers in the North Pole, near the North Pole, that's weighing down on the Arctic. And so some of that land is rebounding up. And so archaeologists have actually focused on that area over the last few decades, not to test Graham Hancock's hypothesis, though coincidentally it does test Graham Hancock's hypothesis. And what it helps us understand is the peopling of the Americas early on, and it helps us understand hunter-gatherers that lived in those regions at the end of the Ice Age. And we have ephemeral traces, for example, footprints, we have stone tools, we have campsites, we have dozens, if not hundreds, I think hundreds of these sites from that region in the Pacific Northwest that document what people are doing. And another region I highlighted is areas where the continental shelf is not too far from the existing coastline. And so in those cases, just because of the geomorphology of that area, the coastline is not actually shifting very much, just by like a few, maybe a kilometer or two, a mile or two tops. So in which case there really isn't any room for some sort of advanced civilization occupying those coasts. So we have 3 different areas where we can test above ground, still above water, still today, for what's going on. And in all those cases all around the world, what we have is hunter-gatherers. So there's no room for some sort of advanced civilization living on those coasts. The second thing we have is actual underwater archaeology. And underwater archaeology is now doing a much better job of targeting sites that date to the end of the Ice Age. And so I have a video on my YouTube with Dr. Jessica Cook-Hale. She's done a lot of this research in the Americas and now in Europe, targeting where to dive based on the geomorphology underwater of what would have been, where you can find this material just based on the geology, if you see what I mean. So you can be strategic and target that period because it's exposed for research in your dives. And she's targeted this and she's found Ice Age sites. And again, they are all occupied by hunter-gatherers. So we can prove this positive, that hunter-gatherers occupied all the face of the planet except for Antarctica during the Ice Age, and we can prove that with targeting each of these different regions. And I also brought up deserts. My dad actually directed a survey in the upper desert of Egypt. And what he did is, just like Jessica Cook-Hale, he targeted wadis. What wadis are dried up river valleys that would have been fertile and lush during the Ice Age when the climate was different. And so he targeted that, saying these are areas where people might have been occupying. And he surveyed hundreds and thousands of sites filled with material from hunter-gatherers. And they had to camp in really harsh conditions. He has an article about how they survived on batteries. Literally, the entire camp was run on car batteries. It was about how to run an excavation in a camp for weeks in a high desert, tough climate conditions with car batteries. And so we are actively, as a field and a discipline, exploring all these regions. And every excavation we do tests Graham's hypotheses. And every single one, the millions of excavations that have happened, have proven him wrong.
I read some statistic where it's like 80% of car crashes happen within 1 mile of your own house. And I think when you talk about ancient civilizations being seafarers, which is a big claim of Graham Hancock, and maybe you could speak to that as well, because I'm not familiar that humans even go back to 50,000 years, which is what he says. But the truth is that, right, you would think you'd find shipwrecks. The map is on the screen right now, or I will. Where are the shipwrecks? They would be right there, right? And that's not what we find. So it's wild. So that was one of the other claims, was when you were in the debate, what you had said was there was a shipwreck that was recently found. It was between 5,000 and 6,000 years old, or I think you might have said 6,000 and 7,000 years old. And this is what they're really also seizing on, saying, well, when we look into what that ship is, it's totally disintegrated. All the wood has gone away from it, and all that's left is the pottery, because that wouldn't disintegrate under the water. And something that you had also said during the debate, and I really liked that comment, and actually I've talked with Mike about it a few times, how when things are buried or when they're underwater, it actually helps to preserve those things. I heard you on the Bridges podcast with Destiny, and you were talking about landfills. So I just want to make a note, Mike, let's come back to landfills, because that's in Mike's wheelhouse.
For sure.
But can you tell us a little bit about that boat that you were referencing? And I believe I saw that you might have been referencing a canoe off the coast of Italy. Is that the one?
Yeah, so I right before I was there was this headline like a month or two ago before about the oldest shipwreck, and it was this, I guess, a canoe. I don't remember. It doesn't matter, because we call a shipwreck a shipwreck regardless of what type of boat it is. We don't have maps of canoe wrecks that contrast with shipwrecks. This is some social media person who doesn't even have much influence quibbling with me over terminology in a way that riles up a fan base, because a preserved boat is a preserved boat. Let's just be honest. And yes, underwater environments are where organic remains can preserve. And it depends on the specific environment that these things are buried in and found in. But we have wood, human-modified wood, going back several 100,000 years from Africa. That's also a recent headline that people can look up. And waterlogged environments, specifically anaerobic environments, are where this kind of stuff can preserve. And so that's really important. But yes, at the same time, a lot of shipwrecks are documented based on other types of materials that are found, whether it's stone or pottery or whatever. It doesn't really matter. Stuff that is found on the clustered on the bottom of the seafloor or ocean floor or lake bed or riverbed or any of these options underwater, right? And so that's also then stems, well, okay, fine. You want to say wood doesn't preserve underwater. A, that's wrong. In a lot of environments it does. But B, okay, if there is a global seafaring, ocean-going civilization that's large and advanced, if they're going to cross the Atlantic, like Graham Hancock mentioned the peopling of Cyprus and the peopling of Australia. Okay, obviously an important undertaking where we don't have any boats, but this is maximum a few dozen kilometers that they're traveling, a couple dozen miles, right? And we're presuming that they're using rafts and canoes because we have evidence for those types of boats early on. We're not talking about the 5,000 kilometers it takes to go across the Atlantic, okay? To be able to do that is a totally different type of technology, a totally different type of ship, and a huge number of supplies to be able to, A, make sure all your sailors survive the long trip, and B, presumably have goods or something that you're trading across that kind of distance. And
or
so,
have some sort of navigational goal or navigational technology, right? You don't just get across by accident.
And so, and on top of it, we're not talking about a 1 or 2 time crossing to Cyprus or Australia to populate for people that are settling, because we don't know how many waves there were of migration. We just know there were people there. Not very many, though. Not very many at all. A small population of hunter-gatherers in both of those regions. He's talking about a globally advanced civilization that apparently traverses the oceans repeatedly and has mapped them out explicitly. In which case, we're not talking about a few rafts. We're talking about a large number of ocean-going vessels filled with supplies and people. So, and then the other reason, which always gets lost, is the quote that I pulled out from Graham is where he's criticizing archaeology, and he's saying underwater archaeology only focuses on all the shipwrecks that exist and does not look for settlements from the Pleistocene, from the Ice Age. And that's what's wrong here. Underwater archaeologists are surveying and looking for whatever they find. And the majority of what's available to be found are these shipwrecks. There are no pyramids from his civilization or the monuments, the megaliths that we should be expecting from his civilization. Where are those?
Well, besides the Bimini Road, but I'm just kidding.
Yes, besides natural features that are not archaeological and have no artifacts, yeah.
So another claimant that I want to address that they put forth is that there's this orthodoxy amongst archaeology that silences any voices that don't fit into a specific paradigm. And to give a little context, my degree is in psychology. I had the privilege of, when I was in high school, of doing an internship at Stony Brook University. So I did a little bit of genetics work. I know how boring, tedious, and disappointing science can be sometimes, but how willing the community is to embrace new information. But there is such a thing as peer review. What they like to do is they like to avoid that whole process. And I'm trying to keep an open mind, although it's very difficult. I tried to watch the first episode of season 2 of Ancient Apocalypse, and when they do a soil sample and they just grab some, random bits of soil without any kind of archaeological remains and try to throw a 20,000-year-old date, is like all they found was old soil. They didn't really prove any kind of structures. And that's what makes scientific methods and design so difficult, is you have to be careful of these, confounding variables. So tell us a little bit what about real archaeology is like, the investigative and the laboratory work that really goes on behind the scenes to make sure we're not just talking out of our bums and there's not this great orthodoxy that resists change. It's just a matter of you have to bring your proof, forward to do so.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, every single scholar in the field is not trying to resist change. We're all trying to actually present new ideas and new evidence. That is what science is about. Every single publication we put out in a peer-reviewed journal is actually rewriting history because we find something new or we have a new method to do it. And so this idea that we are I don't know, trying to cover something up. That's the definition of why this is a conspiracy theory. There's belief that every single archaeologist around the world is trying to hide history or prehistory. That's a conspiracy there. And I just want to highlight how ludicrous that idea is. We're talking about archaeologists in every single country in the world. And we're talking about archaeologists, some of which are employed by governments, some of which are employed by non-profits or universities, and some of which are employed by commercial firms that go in and excavate before a construction or infrastructure is constructed. And so we're talking about a conspiracy that pervades private industry, non-profits, and every single government in the world.
It's to protect that fat paycheck that you receive all the time, I'm sure,
yeah,
right?
and the fat paycheck, and I mean, you know, the other part is if you think about the history of the field, and we don't get along with each other at all. We disagree with each other all the time, about what the reality of history is, right? And what the reality of what happened in the past is. But there are certain clear facts that are just really without doubt. And, you know, when we get radiocarbon dates or thermoluminescence dates, or when we put together the stratigraphy that we can document through soil studies, or when we map out the genome of an individual, that's fairly irrefutable. There might be new methods we can use to do some tweaks on those. So, you know, we keep updating the radiocarbon calibration curves. But that doesn't change like a date from 12,000 years ago to a date from 1,000 years ago. That changes a date from 12,500 years ago to 12,100 years ago, right? That's not actually making that giant of a change. And we have millions now of these radiocarbon dates that have been published from all over the world. I think I cited on Joe Rogan, I forget the Paleolithic radiocarbon database for Europe, which I think actually extends all the way to Siberia. I think it had something like 13,000 different localities within its database. So sites, let alone all the different specific samples from each of those sites, right? Some of them might have had one, but some of them have hundreds. And so, you know, like we're talking about a huge amount of evidence that is really incontrovertible and irrefutable that we all agree on. And some of this really, radiocarbon is the perfect example. I'm actually teaching a class right now here at Cardiff on the history of archaeology and archaeological thought. And, you know, for a long time, a lot of archaeology really was very speculative. And this is something that pseudoarchaeologists and their fans always say, archaeology is just speculation. And what was the giant fact check on archaeological narratives was the development of radiocarbon dating. And so what happened was all of a sudden, with, you know, scholars and antiquarians and hobbyists, they worked really hard to try to say, oh, we have this Egyptian scarab in this level on the island of Crete, so therefore that pottery must date to the same period. But of course, sometimes things get mixed up stratigraphically if you don't have geologists there to explain it to you. And so all these dates sort of ended up slightly off until, and sometimes very off, until radiocarbon dates came around. And one of the good ones is megaliths. So for a long time, it was believed throughout the 19th and first half of the 20th century that the megaliths, these monumental tombs, started in areas like Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean, you know, just a few thousand years ago, and then they slowly spread up until you hit Stonehenge in Northwest Europe. As soon as we started doing radiocarbon dates, we realized that actually that's not true at all. There's not this diffusion of megalithic technology. It shows up in different times at different places. So, in fact, Stonehenge was built much earlier than the monumental tombs that we find in Greece, those tholoi tombs, by thousands of years. And so all these assumptions were flipped on their head. And by the way, do you know that there's two different archaeologists that have won the Nobel Prize? One of them was the inventor of radiocarbon, Willard Libby. The second one was the individual who sequenced Neanderthal genomes, and Svante Pääbo. And so those are the only two archaeologists that have ever won Nobel Prizes, and both of those, the development of both of those methods have been so revolutionary that they've really changed and updated our understanding of the past. We integrate new data and new evidence, and with that is how we rewrite our narratives.
Yeah, well, the conspiracy theory that archaeologists worldwide are keeping out anyone else is totally patently absurd to me. And even Graham Hancock's own experiences disprove that. The guy traveled to find the lost ark in Ethiopia. The guy's been to every chamber in the Great Pyramids. I mean, he's been to Göbekli Tepe likely. And I just saw a video by, maybe you can remind me of her name. She's, I think, a Swedish archaeologist, Kaylee something. And she posted a video.
Kaylee, yeah.
Yeah, and she posted a video saying, here's a video today of archaeologists archaeology and excavation being done at Göbekli Tepe. So what are you going to say about that, Graham? You said an excavation stopped. Can you talk a little bit about that site specifically, what the significance is in real archaeology, and then what their claims might be as well?
Yeah, but before I get to that, I'll get to Göbekli Tepe, but I also want to emphasize that we warmly embrace ordinary people coming in and working with us. There's all sorts of community excavations that you can go volunteer on, no matter where you live in the world. If you look up local museums, local excavations, you could probably volunteer and do archaeology yourself. I have worked myself with a wide range of amateurs and enthusiasts, anything from a French hairdresser in Athens, Greece, who came into the lab once a week just because she wanted to do some archaeology, to plentiful retired people, students, and others who have volunteered on projects. And they are phenomenal archaeologists. We really try to work hardly to incorporate people and to share what we know with people. It's just we don't have the platforms that some of these guys have because we're just making real claims based off of real evidence. So Göbekli Tepe is a great example of something that did, to some degree, overturn a scholarly understanding of the past, particularly in the Near East, but not as much as people think. So when it was found, the first excavators there, Klaus Schmidt, a good archaeologist, but he liked to sometimes overemphasize or exaggerate some of his claims in the press. And he, before having the materials studied to actually make this claim, meaning before the animal bones and the seeds from the site were studied, he claimed that this was the sign of early farmers building these monumental buildings. And Graham Hancock and others took that early assumption and ran with it and popularized it, when in fact, now that thousands of seeds and animal bones have been studied, it turns out that they're all from wild animals and wild plants. So therefore, this was not constructed by people who were agriculturalists. It was constructed by hunter-gatherers. They found an extremely productive niche in the environment where they could live there for at least half of the year, maybe longer, and they could settle down during that time. And it's a debate right now whether they were there year-round or not. They were certainly there at least half the year because we can look at when they harvested these wild crops and when those animals migrated through the mountain pass nearby that they hunted, mostly gazelle. Am I right on that? Yeah, gazelle. Wild wheat and gazelle is what they mostly have there. They also potentially brewed beer. And so that's one way to store your calories, if you see what I mean, by fermenting them.
Right.
And so this is where it's nuanced our understanding of the past. Like I said, every single excavation updates our understanding of the past, and Göbekli Tepe is just a high-profile example of that. And what it showed was in the Southwest Asia, in this area of the Near East, the Fertile Crescent, not only were there agricultural communities that were settling down and building monumental architecture. We've known that for 70 years or so when Kathleen Kenyon excavated the site that's most well known as Jericho, but we now usually refer to it as Tel es Sultan. And so there's monumental architecture, a giant tower, dating to within the same period as Göbekli Tepe's monumental architecture dates to. So we knew there was monumental architecture being built in that region. What we now know is that hunter-gatherers were also engaging in that kind of activity. So there's different pathways that people were taking at that same time, and it adds to the complexity of what's going on when agriculture and sedentary lifestyles are being adopted around that region, really. We did already know that hunter-gatherers were capable of building monumental architecture. That's been well known for decades. As well, for example, like places that Graham actually went to in Ancient Apocalypse Season 1. Poverty Point in Louisiana is a really good example of an extremely monumental mound built by people that were hunter-gatherers. They found a productive niche. They were able to stay there long enough and to, monumentalize that kind of landscape. And similarly, we found monumental structures built even further back into the Ice Age, sort of these monumental structure, I don't even know the right word, these circles of sort of mammoth bones that have been constructed in Siberia and all across Asia. We have a dozen or so, maybe not that many, examples of these kind of, I think in Ukraine as well, these monumental mammoth structures, if you will. And so monumental architecture, it's not something new, but we're getting more complex, the nuance to this perspective on our human past, if you see what I mean. And Göbekli Tepe is great for that. It's phenomenal, and now that it's been identified there, it was not the first site like it in that region. Klaus Schmidt himself found another one earlier, but now that it's been identified, archaeologists have been targeting the region for more investigation, and they found a number of other similar sites that belong to this Tashtepeler culture. And the excavations still continue at Göbekli Tepe with a combined German-Turkish team. Yeah. I talked to Lee Clare, the field director, on my YouTube. The video's up there. It's my most watched YouTube video, actually.
Oh, nice. We're going to link that here.
I think Göbekli Tepe is a good example of where Hancock likes to cherry pick certain evidence, but I think there's two other things we want to tie in here with this question here. He uses a lot of recycled ideas, so it's not that he's making groundbreaking work. He likes to cherry pick certain ideas that support this, seafaring ancient civilization, but then also the big R word, right? So I know there's some controversy online, to steal the line from the article in the Archaeology journal of yours. These are old racist ideas, and it's not to say that Graham is necessarily a racist, and be very, very clear. We're not engaging in ad hominem. It's just merely that he's using old ideas that certain people manipulated for they're justifying certain heinous actions in the past. So I'd love for an opportunity for you to kind of clarify that also, but give some people understanding about this, because it is a little nuanced.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of it actually comes down to the history of archaeology itself. Look, a lot of archaeology in the 19th century was horrendous by our standards. It was extremely colonialist. It was extremely racist. It even, it basically forced indigenous people to work and dig so that Western countries could then plunder that material and take it back to their museums. It also plentiful examples of actual grave robbing of indigenous cemeteries. And so a lot of archaeology at that time was very horrendously colonialist and racist. And so arguing that the collection practices of the British Museum were racist and colonialist, which is indisputably true, does not make the current director of the British Museum a racist. And so the same thing is true for some of the ideas that Graham is citing. He is, for example, citing this trope of white saviors, where there were these gods that had white skin and beards and were described as bringing civilization to the Aztecs or the Maya or the Inca or whatever, when in fact all of our evidence for these white savior tropes, they come from Spanish colonial sources. And so this is a real problem. There's a problem with using that evidence. And if you look at the evidence we have from pre-colonial sources, which, yes, we do, not every single Maya and Aztec codex was destroyed. There's a couple dozen of them that are left. And figures like Quetzalcoatl are depicted on there with dark skin, not with white skin, as a Spanish colonial source describes them. And so we can fact check that and show how these Spanish colonial sources are actually biased. And we can actually understand the milieu within which they were understood. Cortez, in his letters, liked to claim he was being treated as a god. And the idea was disseminated that he was the second coming of this Quetzalcoatl, this white-skinned figure. And so, this is very much clearly a myth propagated by the Spanish, and they even used the myth of Atlantis and the Greek myth of the Hesperides to say, we have claim on this land. It's our ancestors that were here first, and it's been misused for hundreds of years, the same exact trope of a lost civilization. And so, for example, the Trail of Tears, we all learn about that in the U.S., right? Where Andrew Jackson's government dispossessed tens of thousands of indigenous people from their land. Written into the law was this idea that there was an earlier civilization there that was responsible for those mounds, those monumental mounds that were constructed, and saying that it was not the indigenous people that were responsible, so therefore they have no claim to this land, so we can kick them off. And so this trope, this pervasive trope that the indigenous people were not responsible for their own heritage, has been used for real harm in the past as well. And so look, I'm an archaeologist and a historian. I study not just archaeology, what I dig up. I need to engage with the history of these ideas as well. That's what archaeologists do. We put together a literature review at the start of an article or a book. We explain the different ways that this sort of evidence has been interpreted. And so we have to come to grips with the ways that people in the 19th or 18th century interpreted some of the evidence, and then we say, no, this is a better way that takes account of all the new methods and evidence that we have today. And so, critiquing Graham is certainly not calling him a racist, just like critiquing the British Museum, which I do also on podcasts. It's not saying that the director of the British Museum is racist. This is just people not able to have a complicated adult conversation, is how I see it. And so if you want to have an adult conversation, we can have a conversation about the history of ideas. And I think that's also really important. Like you said, a lot of what he says is not new. And that's Really important. People think that his ideas and the way he presents them as if they're original to him, when in fact his books cite these 19th century ideas. They explicitly include them as sources and inspiration for them, and we can trace the history of these ideas and show how they've been proven wrong time and time again. This is not something new. Archaeology has had to contend with believers in Atlantis for hundreds of years. It's been, like any science, what we do is we take hypotheses and we reject them. That's how you come across the truth. You say, here's our evidence. What potential hypotheses could explain it? How can we then test those hypotheses to reject them until we're left with only one? And that's how we explain the past.
Well, that rejection actually brings me to the next topic that I wanted to talk about, because it sounds like that word rejection is maybe too harsh when you're someone like Graham Hancock, because you say, you're canceling me, despite his 500,000 followers on Twitter and his 2 series on Netflix now, or 2 seasons, I should say. And so maybe you could talk to us a little bit about your interpretation or your personal experience over the last couple months with what the other side is calling cancel culture.
I mean, look, let's just be honest. In 2024, being canceled is just a talking term to get more views. What people like to do is say, I've been canceled, so that therefore they have something to talk about on social media and it fits into the culture wars that therefore gets one group of people on your side and another group of people against you. That is just how this works in our world. And Graham Hancock is an expert at this. He has been saying he's been canceled since the 1990s. He is very good at playing the victim. He sued the BBC when they produced a documentary critiquing his first book, Fingerprints of the Gods. He lost every single point in that lawsuit except for one, and they had to cut out about 30 seconds from their documentary and republish it. Something like that, 30 seconds to a minute. You'd have to talk with Chris Hale. He was the publisher on that documentary. I actually hope to have him on my YouTube at some point. And so it's sort of like, it's the same thing with my debate with Rogan. They found one point that I spent 30 seconds on, and he's trying to say that I've lied or whatever, or misrepresented or something bollocks like that. And so he is an expert at going on and saying, oh my God, archaeologists are attacking me. To be honest, I think until Ancient Apocalypse Season 1 came out, very few archaeologists knew who he was. And I can promise you that almost no archaeologist knew what he talked about. They had no idea what his claims were. They thought he was just redating pyramids, because that's what he's oftentimes been on social media talking about. My dad was an Ice Age archaeologist. He's passed away. I don't know what he thought of Graham Hancock, but I know that his colleagues, when I told them I was doing this, they're like, what does that have to do with the Ice Age? I thought he was into pyramids. And I'm like, no, he's situated. And they were like, oh, we had no idea. Nobody ever knew, because he never actually discusses any Ice Age evidence. He just ignores it and instead focuses on pyramids and like that. And so, this is the other issue, is nobody really knew what he talked about. He was just some figure that spouted other random stuff. And that also led to increasing his popularity, because archaeologists would then respond to him and in the media or whatever, and they would assume, since Ancient Aliens was popular through the 2010s, and he was on Ancient Aliens a few times, that his beliefs were Ancient Aliens, when in fact his beliefs are about a lost civilization from the Ice Age. And so they would say, oh, he's just talking about aliens, when he isn't, and then that would lead to his fans saying, see, they don't know what he's talking about, da-da-da-da-da, maybe he is right. And it led to increasing his popularity. And so that's definitely a problem as well. And so I think that he really likes to play up this victim mentality. Some scholarship has referred to it as stigmatized knowledge. As soon as you say, well, they don't want me talking about this, that converts people into thinking that gives it validity, right?
That's a great point. But you've also experienced then the backlash, right, of appearing here, and all of his sycophantic followers have come towards your page and called you this liar and parroted some of the stuff that everyone else has been saying. Can you talk a little bit about that and the repercussions or lack thereof that you've experienced of this?
Yeah, I mean, I've had thousands of people come at me. There are people who don't want to pay attention to what I have to say, so they're very easy to ignore. They whine when I block them from posting on my YouTube, but it's like, what you're posting is irrelevant. You've clearly not listened to the video, so I'm sorry, goodbye. I have a small YouTube channel that's educational, and I'm not going to let it be swarmed by trolls, because Graham Hancock and Joe Rogan have a giant platform of people who don't want to listen to me. So, I'm sorry, but this is not, my forum is not a place for debate. It's a place for education. So yeah, I've experienced lots of harassment and trolling by the thousands. I don't know how many thousands. At the same time, I've also experienced lots of positive comments by the thousands. I don't know how many thousands, including surely close to 1,000 comments or emails or posts from people who used to be Graham Hancock fans.
Awesome.
So, you know, look, this is just the world we live in. It's the same thing when teaching a class. Look, not every student is going to listen to you, and that's just life. I try to make what I say as interesting and understandable as possible to reach as many people as possible, because I want to reach every single student in my classroom so that they learn. But the reality is people are people, and I'm happy to just shrug it off as best as I can, though it does take a lot of time and obviously emotional energy at times. So at the same time, I've had lots of people calling up to get me fired from my job. In fact, Graham Hancock promoted a video by someone who's written on his blog, so an ally of his, where in that video, that person was not just calling for me to get fired, but saying even if we email Cardiff University to get him fired, it might not get him fired, but if we all do it and enough of us do it, some person there is going to take us seriously enough to tell him to shut the up. That's a direct quote. Shut the up. And so, if you want to talk about actual cancel culture is when you do this stuff to people that don't have platforms and support. When someone is a legit celebrity, all they have to do is go around saying, I've been canceled, and then they get people on their side to pay attention. It gets them views, it gets them eyeballs, it's drama, it sells books, it sells TV shows. When there's someone like a scholar or someone with a minor platform, what that does is it floods them out and makes it so that if you Google my name, which is fairly recognizable, a bunch of the top results are about me being a liar. And so this actually has a real impact on real ordinary people who are not celebrities. I'm hopeful that at this point I can ride this storm. I have enough support. I'm hopefully just enough of a minor celebrity that will carry the day, and those facts will actually be at the top of the Google search results. And I think they still are by and large. But it certainly has an impact, and I am definitely a precarious scholar. I have a part-time contract here at Cardiff University. I've been recovering from cancer, so I'm not willing to go fully on the job market right now. And now I could be seen as a liability to different employers in academia. And so it's just sort of like what they are doing, these people who believe in free speech, is exactly the opposite of free speech. What they are trying to do is shut me down so I cannot respond, so that people on their side will not take me seriously. And all I can say is, look, man, I just stared death in the face on a year of chemo. I was sliced from bicep to pectoral to remove all my lymph nodes. They can kiss my ass. I'm not going to shut up. You think you're going to silence me? Like, kiss my ass. You guys are a bunch of flaming turds if you think I'm going to shut up. The reality is I've woken up a lot of people to what archaeology has to say, and I will continue educating people and sharing my perspective on the field with it, because that's what I do.
I'm very thankful for that. So, no offense, but I had not known about your end in your participation in archaeology. I'm kind of an Egyptology nerd, if I was to, say my interests were. But I'm very thankful that you go out and do the work that you do and try to communicate science and archaeology. I hate to see you suffer the slings and arrows of misfortune like you do, but it's really important, I think, what you do, because I wouldn't have known about your work or what you do if you had not gone on to Joe Rogan and taken on the task of a 4-hour debate about not really knowing what you're going in there with and just hoping that you do the best. So I do want to kind of turn this into a more positive note instead of just saying cancel culture this and they're trying to do this to you. So what inspired you to get into archaeology? I know your father obviously was a prominent member of the community, but I guess also too was what inspires you to continue to do so, that magic, that thirst for knowledge, right? So what would you say to inspire the next generation of folks thinking about this?
Yeah, I mean, look, archaeology is a hell of a lot of fun. And some archaeologists say it's the most fun you can have with your pants on. I've seen people write that, right? And so it's a real interesting challenge. It's a weird field. For one, I actually didn't want to do archaeology until I was about 20, partly because my dad was doing it, right? I didn't want to be like a Nepo baby. And what I discovered is that in the U.S., archaeology, there is no departments of archaeology. There's departments of anthropology and then departments of like classics or history or Near Eastern studies where they employ archaeologists. And so I realized since my dad was well known in the anthropology circles, I could do more historical periods and I wouldn't have professors who knew who my dad was. So therefore I could feel like I'm pioneering my own path, if you see what I
Sure.
mean, without that kind of leg up from just following in my dad's footsteps. A lot of archaeologists who are in the same family as another, or scholars even, they do the exact same thing. Right, you know, you have the Leakey clan. They all do human evolution, and they're all great. I'm not trying to diss them. They're a real, legit archaeological dynasty. But I really wanted to make sure I did my own kind of thing, so that because I have a chip on my shoulder. My brother's name is Chip. My dad loved archaeology, though.
Teeth.
Yeah, and so my dad loved archaeology, and he was just as engaging and laid back and informal as I am, and as good a communicator as I was. And he passed away suddenly from cancer about 6 years ago, and like really suddenly. He actually only got the final diagnosis of what kind of cancer it was the day before he died, and so that's how sudden it was. And so I get that from him, my way of explaining things and some of my perspective on archaeology as a field. And so I've realized I wanted to do archaeology. I was a history major at the time. And I sort of said, you know what? We should be taking this kind of scientific prehistoric approach and be applying it to historical periods. Because even in historical periods, so much of the day-to-day of what we actually dig up is still piecing together a voiceless history of the past. And that gets into what archaeology actually is. Archaeology is in many ways very menial. You're cataloging millions of broken up animal bones or potsherds, or you're mapping out thousands of walls or bits of architecture and different phases within that wall. And then you have to take those pieces of the puzzle and actually, line them all up. And we have a wide variety of tools, all of which are very scientific and very objective, not subjective, in how we line them all up in time and space. And then from that, to try to give voice to these people from the past that we don't have their voice anymore. Right? We don't have these historical texts from them. Even if you're excavating, say, colonial village in Virginia from the 18th century, chances are we don't have any texts from that settlement. And so this is still a voiceless history that we are writing. We're trying to give these people a voice to tell the stories of what they did, what their activities and behavior was. And in that sense, it really is like kind of putting together an interesting puzzle. And you have to collaborate with a wide range of people in today's world in particular. Archaeology is not what it used to be. It used to be any sort of article was written by one person. Now that's becoming rarer and rarer. We all have all of our different subdisciplines and different methods that we use and different expertises that we have. And so we all have to come together and figure out how it all slots together. And so it's very much a cooperative, collaborative discipline where we are working with people in every single, what I always tell my students is, can you name one discipline, scholarly discipline or expertise that is not relevant to the study of archaeology? And they'll come at me with everything, right? And I mean everything. They'll be like, what about space exploration? And it's like, nope, I know somebody that studies the archaeology of the International Space Station. I know somebody that studies the Anthropocene of the moon, right? We can actually study that. They'll say hairstylists. And it's like, nope, I actually know of an actual hairstylist who is not an archaeology by training, who published an who published an article with archaeologists and art historians about hairstyles in ancient Rome from statues. And so you can really go on any single discipline or skill set in the world, whether it's from languages and art and humanities, through to economic and politics and anthropology, the social sciences, through to the hard sciences like physics and chemistry, biology, astronomy, etc. They are all applied to archaeology, as is all of our sort of practical skills, whether it's computer information systems and digital techniques and methods to map out stuff or to create databases and do large data analyses, to statistics and mathematics, to engineering. I've worked with somebody who designed skyscrapers in Dubai. That was his main job, and on his holidays, he worked with archaeologists to help us understand the architecture, and he collaborated with us. We respected his knowledge, and he respected our knowledge, because that's what archaeology is. It is more interdisciplinary. It's the most interdisciplinary field in the world because it studies humans in the past and uses every tool set to be able to do so.
Yeah, that is awesome, Flint, and it's so well said. It really has to be this collaborative effort, and I don't think that having a skeptic on the excavation site is really a productive part of that team, so I can see why it's been very frustrating for you. Hey, before we wrap it up here, I did want to put something in front of you that's interesting. I have this Twitter base, and I sometimes can get controversial on it. And, you know, when you rage bait, of course, you get more attention. So there's one tweet I wanted to ask you about because the attention that it got was definitely outsized, and it relates to these earlier civilizations, and I'm probably even saying that wrong. But the tweet that I wrote was, "My ethnicity, question mark? I'm American." And this created a massive stir, hundreds, if not thousands of people coming at me saying, "You are not, you've got to be from Scotland or Ireland or, you know, you've got to be from the UK or Italy." And I said, well, what about when they came across from the Bering Land Bridge and there was only one continent of Pangaea? How far back do we go? I was calling them Euro supremacists, and I know now the word Eurocentric. So when you see something like that, I appreciate that you're laughing at it, but because it is a joke, obviously. But what is your response, and how can you explain that to a layman like me, where how do we pick what era of history determines an ethnicity in that way?
There's no hard and fast rules for that. Cooper. Or Cooper you go by, right? Cooper?
Yes, Cooper. My parents, bless them, they gave me 2 first names, Charles Cooper. So.
Yeah, exactly. So, look, there's no hard and fast rule to this. This has been one of the major revelations of sequencing human genomes. So the very first full sequenced human genome was, at this point, less than 30 years ago, I think. So the late 90s, I think, was when we first sequenced him. And now that we've started to be able to put together genomes of people around the world, as well as many ancient genomes, what we realize is that scientifically, there's no such thing as a race or an ethnicity. We are all fairly closely related to one another. We have way too much overlap in our DNA. If we want to classify people based on how they look or what they claim based on their identity and their history as, say, African versus European, there is more difference, genetically speaking, between different subgroups in Africa or different subgroups in Europe than there is between being European or African. Like that is just how it goes. These identities of ethnicity and race, the reality is that humans have mingled a whole heck of a lot. And as we understand more about human evolution, there's this idea of a family tree. I just taught about this in a class too, so it's fresh in my brain. This family tree where we sort of have these ancestral roots, we branch out, and one of them is ours, and that's humanity and persists, right? We've realized now that we've found so many more fossils than we had 50 years ago or 20 years ago even, now that we've sequenced far more genomes and we can understand the history of population relatedness is really how we think of it, kinship rather than ethnicity or race. Now that we understand that, we've seen that actually thinking of it as a family tree where we all diverge is wrong. Instead, it's more like a braided stream. Different channels diverge, but then they reintegrate together. And so that's what we're seeing. Think of like a river delta, where the river starts splitting up and then braiding back together. And we're starting to see it's just like how we all know that everybody in the planet has Neanderthal DNA in them. Everybody on the planet, no matter what continent you're from, you're part Neanderthal. Everybody on the planet is also part Denisovan. And, you know, when this was first realized, geneticists got this wrong. They thought people from Africa weren't. However, because of populations coming back to Africa and all the intermingling that happened, we now know with a closer look that every single African also has Neanderthal DNA and Denisovan DNA. What's different is how much a percentage of our DNA comes from those groups. And so we very much are a braided stream. All of these different lineages of hominids and hominins, many of them re-merged back together. And so it's the same thing with ethnicity and race. We see this as these splits, when in fact, on a scientific level, what we can establish is that we're all much more closely related than we think. It's actually surprising. And this is all fairly new. We've only really been able to sequence large numbers of ancient human genomes recently with what's called next generation sequencing. So really everything that people, including me, understand about ancient human DNA, it is one publication at a time being flipped on its head. And so we are learning so much more, and it's happening very rapidly as it becomes more affordable and doable on older genomes. Yeah.
Despite my saying that my tweet was provocative, based on your answer, I do feel vindicated for it. So thank you.
I always feel frustrated when people claim, "Oh, I have German ancestry," and it's like Germany didn't exist until 1871. So how far back are you really tracking, right? That's what always frustrates me.
And that's the whole point. This idea is more about identity. And in which case, that's fine. Everybody should have their own identity and understanding. There's nothing wrong with having that identity and understanding. But I also think that people really should understand how modern scholars, whether they're scientists or historians, understand the past, and I think that's important to be able to. One of the complaints I always have is everybody thinks they know history. It's something we all learn all the time, and therefore we're all justified to do it. And that's fine. Everybody go do what you want. But there is expertise involved here and knowledge of a lot of evidence. There is a reality to what archaeologists and other scholars and historians are doing. And go do your own research, but at the same time, have a little bit of respect for the hard work and experience we have. It's because we do a lot of work. We're not just bullshitting.
No, it's
Often
very clear.
Yeah.
And actually, I know we're at our hour now, and I want to let you go, but I want to ask if you have just 5 more minutes. When we proceed into the future, you've done an awesome job at encapsulating our past. I want to know in 100 years, in 1,000 years, when people go and excavate Manhattan, which is a pile of rubble, or they excavate Southern Virginia, which might never have been even that populated, what exactly are we going to see, and what are people going to find when they're in your position in 1,000 years?
I mean, so it all varies based on what happens. So I know that sounds like a weird cop-out, but let me explain. And this is actually part of the reason. This actually is really interesting because it's also one of the key things that I didn't have time to go in on Joe Rogan for why Graham Hancock is surely wrong. And part of that is that destruction is an archaeologist's best friend. So when things get destroyed suddenly, whether it's a volcanic eruption like at Pompeii or Herculaneum or Santorini, or an earthquake leveling a city, or some invaders coming in and tearing down and burning down buildings, that actually produces a lot of rubble that preserves material in space for archaeologists of the future to find. Destruction, we always joke about in our classes that destruction is our best friend, right? And it sucks for the people in the past. Don't get me wrong, when some sort of major destruction event happens. But
when Pompeii burns in place.
Yeah, but for archaeologists, God, that's lovely. That's what we want. So in that sense, if New York or Manhattan is destroyed suddenly, we're going to find a snapshot in time that tells us about that period when it was destroyed. I study ancient Athens. When the Persians destroyed Athens in 480 BC, that is one of our best snapshots of life in Athens. Because they have, even though they've rebuilt and they renovated, we have these deposits related to that destruction. It's oftentimes in renovation sort of deposits. They're building a new building, they tear down and rubble and level it out, and buried right there is the remnants of what was going on in, say, 600 BC, 600 to 480 BC. And so that's like one of our best snapshots around 480 BC of Athens. So on the other hand, when you have constant renovations happening because people are constantly living there and rebuilding and renovating and things like that, that destroys evidence for what was happening in that building recently. Right. And so you're not seeing stuff as clearly from a continuously occupied settlement, except for snapshots when something gets razed to the ground and then rebuilt, and then you get that phase or whatever. Sometimes you can date different renovations and things like that on a building, depends on what they are and how. And so, that's actually what matters, is what's the state of preservation. Our landfills will be really interesting because our landfills are all rapidly deposited. We produce way too much trash, and it's causing lots of problems on our planet. But in areas where we have landfills, we see this deposition in layers, and we actually already have garbology already exists, and modern archaeologists are currently studying our own landfills. In fact, in the 90s, when this really started taking off, there was a major revelation that things aren't decomposing as fast as we think they are. And it's to an archaeologist, that's not actually a major revelation, because like I said, when things get buried rapidly because of destruction, they survive.
Wow. Well, I will say future archaeologists are going to rip their hair out when they make it to Staten Island, New York, because that place was a landfill and now it's a city. Now it's residences. Like, oh my God, I can't imagine having to figure that out.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's the everyday artifacts, the day-to-day things that we would use that are the most interesting, and not the ideal culture, which is what an imperial administration might preserve in those records. Although they are important for context, right?
Or some monolith, right?
Right. We want to know what the people were doing day to day and what tools and even just personal effects that they had. That really tells more of the culture that we want to know about. Isn't that right?
Yeah, and I mean, it depends on what your questions are. I think we're trying to do both. And we can do both, is the reality. I mean, for a long time, archaeology was the study, and history. When we learned history when we were young, it's like this king followed by that king, this president followed by that president. But now we're starting to learn more social history. What was life like for ordinary people? What was the different ways that people live their lives? And so archaeology has both. And so I think both are extremely important. And I think that's a way that we should use to get people interested in the past. Because if you're only interested in just the hoity-toity wealthy elites and the celebrities, well then that's a pretty boring picture of the past. It's like if all we do is pay attention to Elon Musk and other celebrities and wealthy people like him. And it's like, man, the part of what makes social media so phenomenal is, yes, it's sort of dominated by some of these celebrities, but you also get to look up scholars and ordinary people that are doing stuff and have interesting stories to tell. And
Folks
so that's
like
part of
yourself.
what's so amazing. Yeah. And I think that's what we're interested in today, is that kind of stuff. That's why celebrity has really changed in its way. And I mean, it's like, still amazes me the amount of celebrity and attention that came down in this last week to try to discredit me. It's like, you can see how challenged Graham Hancock was to have to get people with huge platforms to try to discredit me. Someone who has a minor platform, a precarious employment, and all this stuff, and it's like, I have these really powerful people trying to cancel me. It's like,
you must be
I'm
onto
thumbing
something.
my nose at you, you know?
Well, you are certainly the most famous archaeologist in pop culture today, and that's why I'm just so grateful that you came on our show, man. And I don't mean that sarcastically or facetiously. I mean that truly. You've done a remarkable job stepping into the wolf's den here with the person that says, I'm going to decimate you, and you politely, respectfully explained, that's not correct, sir. And it blew me away. So I am, again, the case study of someone where my feed was filled with election misinformation and filled with right-wing politics out of Dan Bongino and Charlie Kirk. And now I'm really refreshed to see excavation at Göbekli Tepe. And I've said it wrong every single time I've said it. But it's been really cool, honestly, to be thrust into this world. And actually, I've already been in touch with your colleague, Dr. Hoops, and we're going to have him on next month as well to talk about other cool stuff, but more of a focus on the science and the archaeology as well.
Great.
Flint, thank you so much. Where can people go to find you? Where do you want to direct people?
Primarily to my YouTube. I think that's where I do most of my public engagement, where I put effort in. Meaning I interview colleagues about what's going on in real archaeology, and I put out scripted videos or replies and things like that. So YouTube is Archaeology with Flint Dibble. My handle is Flint Dibble. I'm on a wide range of other social media, typically under Flint Dibble as well. And so you can find me on X or whatever, really. And but most of my serious effort is going to be on YouTube. I think that archaeology works better by showing people the evidence we have, and that visual, conversational way of going about it on YouTube is, I think, very effective. And I want to continue building that, because I firmly believe archaeology is growing in popularity right now, and it's the right time to try to share the real perspective. One thing I didn't get to go into, which I always like to bring up, is I tend to think that editors and producers, they for whatever reason, they want to rewrite our narratives so that the narratives of what 21st century archaeologists do can't get out there, because they think the public is interested in A, B, X, Y narrative. And so it makes it really challenging for us to get our own narratives out there. And so what I'm always trying to do is to actually share the kind of narratives that archaeologists in the 21st century are creating, and it's not what people think it is. It's actually what we're doing.
You've been tremendously successful in making it engaging, interesting, and accessible. So thank you to you. Thank you to your colleagues who are doing the right thing. And thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
This has been Elevated Thoughts.